So we have finished Matthew 18. Finally, it took us a long time to get there, but there was a lot of stuff in that particular chapter. We are at a point where we are now physically moving toward Jerusalem. You remember I said some time ago that, I'm going to say philosophically or in mind, in thought and mind, we start traveling toward Jerusalem. Jesus starts pointing his ministry toward the events that we're going to read about in Jerusalem, the end of his ministry, the Passion Week, that sort of thing. And so we went through all of chapter 16, all of chapter 17 with that idea in mind, chapter 18, and now chapter 19, it actually says we start traveling there. We actually put feet to the ground and we start going towards Jerusalem. So if you remember our little drawing, Mediterranean Sea, and we have Sea of Galilee up here, and then Jordan River, and then we've got the Dead Sea down here. Jerusalem is somewhere right around here. And Galilee, we've spent most of our time in the Galilean region. That's way up here. And we have gone everywhere, and that's not to say that Jesus didn't make a trip or two down south, but all of the ministry, per se, has happened in the northern region. Well, the first bit of chapter 19 says we're starting to travel south. We're traveling toward Jerusalem, and it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Most scholars understand this to be this area over here. When they say other side of the Jordan, they're talking about the east side, generally. Now, there are other scholars that say, no, really, depends on your perspective, and that could mean that he went through Samaria. Remember, there was that episode where he did travel south and he did go through Samaria. I don't think that was necessarily likely here, given the way that it's described, but either way, he's going south. He does apparently spend some time in this area. Now, if you remember, this area was part of the area controlled by Herod Antipas. Remember the Herod that killed John the Baptist. He was in control of Galilee and this place called Perea. And so he actually had control of some of this area over here. Remember Macarius, where John the Baptist was put into prison? And it was over here somewhere? Okay. So Jesus is traveling south. The normal way that most people travel, most good Jews traveled south, was they crossed over the Jordan and they traveled the east side down, and then they crossed back over long about Jericho. And then you travel the Jericho road up to Jerusalem. So that was the normal way that most, I'm going to say good Jews, in that culture, the perceived good Jews would travel. Partly because the travel was easier over there, and partly because they didn't really like Samaria. And so they wanted to avoid that area. So that's the normal route of travel. So that's probably how Jesus was traveling toward Jerusalem. So when it says other side of Judea or other side of Jordan, that's probably what is intended. So he's on his way south. Verse 2, large crowds followed him. By this point, remember, we are well into his ministry. We're actually pushing close to 2.5 years at this point in his ministry. So he is very well known. Not only in the Galilean region, but remember, a lot of word had gotten down to Jerusalem, and they sent ambassadors up there to say, hey, what's going on? Also, if you remember that episode where he crossed over the Sea of Galilee, and the man that had all the demons in him, the legion, wanted to go with Jesus, and Jesus told him what? No, stay here and tell people about what happened to you. So it could be that he was one of the first missionaries. And he was a missionary to all of these Gentile people over here. Because this was the Decapolis, part of the Decapolis, where it was a largely Gentile population. And we read that a lot of Gentiles from these areas would come and they'd visit Jesus and want in on the same healings that the Jews had. So these people could have easily traveled south as well. So what we read in verse 2, large crowds followed him and he healed them. This is really nothing new, right? It's just what he did. It's part of what he did. Part of his ministry. All right. And now we get to, I'm going to say, a tough conversation even for people today. This next little bit is about what we read as divorce, but Jesus' context is marriage. So this is a really kind of a tough conversation, both for the people of that time and for today. Did you know how many marriages in the U.S., we'll just say the U.S., approximately percentage-wise, how many marriages end in divorce? Too many? Half? Okay. Right. Research, some years ago, 20, 30 years ago, it was easily half. Research now says that it is a little less than that. The divorce rate is going down. A study from SMU puts it at 39%. Okay. Go ahead.
Is that because there's not as many marriages?
Studies also show not as many people are getting married. Yes. A lot of times they are waiting longer. Sometimes you're wiser the longer you wait. Definitely economics plays a part in it. And so sometimes the longer you wait, the more economically prepared you are for what you're going to encounter. But a large portion of marriages today end in divorce. And even more so, second marriages. The American Psychological Association has statistics out there, and they say that second marriages, to a larger extent even than first marriages, end in divorce. I actually wrote a lot of these kind of stat kind of things down. 90% of individuals in the Western cultured world get married by the age of 50. So even though they are waiting longer, eventually it looks like they do get married. It's hard to know with the millennials today because they haven't reached 50. So whether or not they will get married by the time they're 50 or not, I don't know. The stats seem to say that millennials stay together more than pre-millennials. more than people from 20, 30, 40 years ago. But again, there are fewer cases to look at when it comes to millennials, both because of their age. They are younger, so there are just fewer cases to look at, and they're waiting longer to get married, so fewer of them are actually getting married. So Jesus is out doing his thing, doing his ministry work, and he is approached by Pharisees. Is this a shock? No. This happens over and over, doesn't it? We've seen it before. Verse 3, some Pharisees came to him to pat his back. No, they came to test him. They wanted to put him in a position of either discomfort or make him look bad in front of the people. And they would do that by applying their law or their understanding of the law on situations that he kind of found himself in. Remember when his disciples were plucking grain in the field on the Sabbath, and they brought their application of the law. How come your followers are basically profaning the Sabbath? And he had to turn the tables and tell them what the Sabbath was really all about. You remember that one. Well, now they're saying something about divorce. Why would they ask Jesus about divorce? That's kind of a strange thing to bring to Jesus. Verse 3, Pharisees came to him to test him, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now the NIV actually has, I would say, a good rendering there. Any and every reason. And they're asking this of Jesus. Those of us reading in today's context would go, well, that's kind of out of the blue. Why were they interested in this question? It goes back to an argument that they had among themselves about Deuteronomy 24. And we'll read Deuteronomy 24 in just a second. But this argument that they had among themselves, there was one school of thought, one rabbi with his pupils, that propagated the idea that the only reason for divorce is some literal, exclusive act of gross indecency of some kind. They would call him the conservative among the teachers. So in today's language we may say, only because of infidelity. Now, I don't think that that's what he meant, because we could actually go to Leviticus 20, verse 10, and see that in the Jewish minds, the act of infidelity, the act of adultery, was cause for what? Stoning, death. Death. Now, in that culture, in the first century, the Jews didn't have the right to kill someone. They had to appeal to Rome to have them killed, which kind of makes John 8 funny, because they bring the woman caught in adultery to Jesus, and they all have stones in their hands ready to kill her. Well, they couldn't have done that anyway, legally. But the idea is there. So, in their mind, adultery equated to the death penalty. So I don't think that Rabbi Shammai really means that divorce is only acceptable in the case of adultery. I think it was something akin to adultery, or some sort of marital infidelity that wasn't the sexual interaction. But he was a conservative. Now, we also had another rabbi at the time, Rabbi Hillel, and the Jews actually have a lot of their ways and means come down from Rabbi Hillel. He was the liberal of the teachers. And Rabbi Hillel interpreted Deuteronomy 24, and we'll read that verse here in a sec, as, well, you know what, let's go ahead and read it, because I want you to have this context before I say what I'm going to say. Deuteronomy 24. This is a section that's headed in our Bibles as miscellaneous laws. It is part of the law of Moses, law given through Moses. But Jesus said, or God through Moses says, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. All right, let's just stop there. That was the argument. When a man marries a woman and finds something displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, that it's the indecent part that's actually under discussion. Rabbi Shammai, that indecent part was something closer to the level of adultery. Rabbi Hillel could be as simple as, you didn't cook my food right. Pretty liberal. Pretty liberal. Basically included anything that she might have done. Put too much seasoning on my meat. Okay? He was considered the liberal, and who do you suspect the larger part of the culture followed? The culture mainly adopted the teachings of Hillel, the more liberal of the teachings. So, by and large, people, and the Pharisees were generally the leaders of the common people, understood divorce in this context. As long as you found some issue, some problem with your wife, you were free to give her a bill of divorce. That was just a common teaching. I will say there was one other teacher at the time who took it a little farther and said, well, finding something indecent in her meant that you had a roving eye and you found someone more attractive. Rabbi Akiba was his name. permitted divorce when you found someone more attractive than your wife. Well, that suited Deuteronomy 24, they'd say. And so they brought this question to Jesus. I think they brought this question to Jesus because this question, they knew what his response would be, I think. But they wanted him to voice it because his response would have been counter to what the larger portion of his followers had thought, had understood, had been taught. And so by having Jesus voice his thoughts about divorce, he would have alienated a number of his followers, which is what they wanted. They wanted to make sure his followers fell away. So they test him. They ask him this question, not because they wanted to know for sure, but because they wanted him to expose himself. So, going back, well, let me read I'm going to read the rest of that Deuteronomy. I'm going to start again with 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. That's the complete essence of that particular verse and command. We'll come back to that. Okay? So, back to Matthew 19. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife, and here's the catch, for any and every reason? They want Jesus to have some dialogue about that any and every reason. What are the reasons, Jesus, that a man could divorce his wife? Well, Jesus kind of flips it on them. Jesus says, I'm not going to discuss divorce. Let's go back to the essence, and that's marriage. Let's start talking about marriage, he says. So, he says, haven't you read? That right there was an insult. I love it when Jesus says that, because these are the scholars of the world, and they're the book people of the world. And when Jesus says, haven't you read, it's like snubbing them. It's like, ha, you don't know your texts. Okay? Haven't you read, he says, that in the beginning, or at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Jesus says, I'm not going to play your game. You're asking reasons for divorce. I'm asking why divorce exists. Let's go back even farther to the creation, to the beginning. And so he pulls from Genesis 1, and then he also pulls from Genesis 2. Genesis 1 talks about God, the Godhead, saying, let's make man, and let's create them in our image. And male and female, he created them, or they created them. So, male and female was created by God. And then you get to Genesis 2, and it talks about how Eve was created and what Adam thought of Eve. And he was just in awe and said, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman. And it talks about the two uniting. And that was the intention. The uniting of the male and female in a bond of marriage was the intention. Because what was it? God was looking for a helpmeet for Adam, and none was found, so he created one. And the whole intention was that they would form a union, and as one, tend the garden, tend to creation. Okay? So that was the essence of what creation was in the first place. And Jesus brings that to mind. Now, if you were a Pharisee, you would feel put in your place, because you came to talk about divorce and argue divorce, and Jesus is saying, why are we even asking this question? Because the way God intended things, divorce wasn't in the picture. So they had to rearrange their argument really quickly. Okay? You know, when things don't go your way, what do? You change the argument. We see that a lot today, don't we? Well, they changed their argument. They said, oh, he kind of trapped us. So let's work our way out of the trap. Why then, they say, in verse 7, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Well, if divorce wasn't supposed to happen in the first place, why did Moses even offer it? In fact, he didn't offer it. He said, you should. You better do it this way. And if it wasn't supposed to happen, then, Jesus, you're not following Moses here. And everyone knows, good Jews follow Moses. You heard it in the lesson this morning. Okay? And Jesus replied this, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Wait a minute. What did they ask? Why did Moses command? They twisted the words of Moses in such a way that it made them look better. Well, Moses didn't just allow, he commanded that we do this thing of divorce. If we see something bad in our wife, it behooves us to kick her out of our house. And Jesus says, no. See you. Okay. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Jesus says, no, that's not what he said at all. In fact, it's not that he commanded, he permitted. And he permitted it because of Genesis 3. So Jesus took them to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. What happened in Genesis 3? Man decided for himself how to live his life. Man became hard-headed, hard-hearted in a lot of ways. All the women here are like, yeah, that's for sure. Hard-headed husbands. No. No. Man decided to live life like he wanted to. Now, we talked last week that there are consequences to that. But from that time to even today, we choose to live the way we want to live. And because of that, divorce happens. Moses was not even saying whether divorce was right or wrong in this particular passage. Notice this. I didn't write it down. If we go to Leviticus 21, and you don't have to go there if you don't want. I'm going to really quickly read it. Leviticus 21, and again, we're in the law. This was rules for the priests. Verse 7. They must not marry women defiled by prostitution, obviously, or divorced from their husbands. Wait, what? So there were regulations about who the priest could marry, and the priests were regulated that they could not marry divorced women. Does it say anything about reasons for divorce there? No, it doesn't. Okay, all right, so let's go to the next one.
You're saying married, like, not themselves, but performing marriage?
No. Get married to. Get married to. Leviticus, again, same chapter, 21, verse 14. This is talking about the high priest. The woman he marries must be a virgin. He must not marry a widow, a divorced woman, or a woman defiled by prostitution. Interesting. Let's go to chapter 22, a little bit further. Verse 13. If a priest's daughter becomes a widow or is divorced, yet has no children, and she returns to live in her father's household as in her youth, she may eat her father's food. Okay. Again, nothing saying why the divorce occurred, whether it was right or wrong. Where am I going with this? Divorce was acknowledged. It was something that was a part of their world. And so the laws that we see deal with that state, that fact. It does not regulate divorce that we've seen. It creates boundaries around what occurs with or without a woman who has been divorced. A little bit of a nuance there, right? Okay. We see the same thing in Numbers 30, if we want to go to Numbers 30, verse 9. But I think I've kind of introduced the thing enough. Divorce was just a matter of fact. So when we get to Deuteronomy 24, this is not about whether a person can be divorced. The whole argument that they bring to him, their question, is it right for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And then they use Deuteronomy 24. But let's go back to Deuteronomy 24. Let's see what it really says. Now, mind you, this is how they read it. If a man takes a wife and she does not find favor in his eyes, he shall write a bill of divorce and shall send her away. That's how they were reading it. Is that really what it says? Let's see. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he's found something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her out of his house, and if after that she leaves his house and becomes the wife of another man, and if her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, sends her out of his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again. So the only command in all of that is the disallowing of the remarriage from the first husband after she's been taken in from the second husband. It says nothing about reasons for divorce at all there. I don't know. I hadn't heard that, haven't read that, but that doesn't mean it's not true. If they were doing that, I would question why they were doing that. There is rationale, I suppose, for them to kill their wives if the wife was caught in adultery, because that's part of the law. So the question may be, what constitutes adultery? So there may have been argumentation around exactly how much adultery do we have to evidence before we have the opportunity to kill our wives? I haven't heard that was prevalent, but at the same time, I'm not saying it couldn't have been. It doesn't surprise me. Muslims have not adopted a lot of the fairness laws that we've adopted in the West. They still are highly patristic. It's all about the male. It's all about the husband. Is patristic the word? I'm trying to remember if patristic's even the word. Huh. It wouldn't surprise me. They kind of have a habit of killing a lot of people. And they are ready to dismiss people from their own families when they don't agree. Yeah, absolutely. And we have to remember that's an Eastern culture. And so was this. This was an Eastern culture too. So a lot of their cultural aspects, their cultural regulations kind of stem from the same ideas, the same thought patterns. Honor killings. Yeah, honor killings. Yeah. That's sad. I do know that Jews were encouraged to marry. It was, in fact, required of certain levels of Jews if you wanted to attain certain offices of political influence or power. There's a lot of debate as to whether Paul was ever married, the Apostle Paul. If he wasn't, I think he was. Personally, I think he was at one time. I think he was a widower. And we could go through verses where I'm led to believe that. But if he wasn't married, he was certainly en route to be married, because if you were working toward a position in the Sanhedrin, one expected the Sanhedrin to be married, a member of the Sanhedrin. And we do know that he was kind of targeted for that. A very capable student of Gamaliel. So yes, I think in the same way that I said 90% of people today in the Western cultures get married, a large portion, very, very large portion of individuals in that day and age got married as well. Okay. It was encouraged. So, what was Moses saying in this law? If he wasn't saying anything about reasons for divorce, what was he saying? Where in all of that sentence, that whole bit of law, is a requirement given? At the very end. If all of this is true, if a woman is found indecent by a husband for whatever reason, we're not going there, and if he dismisses her, gives her a bill of divorce, that bill of divorce is important. Okay, gives her a bill of divorce, moves on. If she gets married to another person, if for some reason she finds herself single again, and I say that because it says either divorced or he dies, then, and here's where the command is, here's where the requirement is, she can't go back to the first husband. That's the regulation in this verse. And I think it has a lot more to do with legacy, heritage, inheritance. Because when you start mixing children from different parentage, it really mixes up the heritage, the line, the family line. And the family line was important. We see in the first of Matthew and the first of Luke how important was the family line of Jesus. Okay. Lineage meant everything. And so God's saying, look, if you start playing those games, you're going to really mix up your family lines, and it's going to frustrate my purposes for the people, for the land, for the inheritance in general, and for your representation of me to the world around you.
How does that mess up the lineage? Because they didn't care about women. They didn't include them in the lineage. It was all male-driven.
Because she may have a son from both families.
But it would still be the husband's son on each family. And so that, I would assume that the first husband's son would stay with his ownership of property and wealth, and then the second husband's would stay with it. Because, I mean, it's not like the mom mattered. It's not like the wife inherited the husband's property if the husband died, right? I mean, women did not win any time at all.
I think it's, your point is good. I think we're thinking of it from a Western perspective. Okay. If you start thinking bloodline, there's a mixing of blood. So when that, let's just say second birth, and it doesn't say, I'm just kind of postulating here, but when that second birth happens, whose blood is it? The woman's blood is tainted at that point. I'm postulating. because she's now been with more than one person. If there was no male heir, she could inherit land. That was a provision that wasn't made initially, but it came afterward when 4 daughters were like, hey, what about us? And so Moses said, good question. And he went to God and asked the question, and God says, yes, this is what you do. So yeah, there is that as well. It's interesting, and I don't have it nailed down, but how zealous God is for the land provisions that he made. It's incredible to see, and it keeps coming back to that in a lot of ways. Adultery in general. One of the no-nos of adultery is because of the land inheritance and how it muxes that up. Today we're like, what does that matter? But to God it really was meaningful. He cared about the land. And land is his creation as well. It was interesting. But it's a good question. And I don't know that I know the answer, but I believe there's something to it, and I don't know what it is.
I'm just curious in lineage, and most of the time the Bible just
Yeah.
the son of the son of the son of.
Right, yes. But you have to be born to. born to someone. Yeah. No.
Along those same lines, so if we're talking about lineage, then maybe the first generation or second generation, you're not going to notice too much. But further down the line, if they start mixing up, you are.
Yes.
Maybe that's where they're looking at more.
Yes.
There can happen.
There was definite interest in purity of bloodlines, purity of lineage. That's one of the reasons, outside the fact that the purity came from Gentiles, or the impurity came from Gentiles, but that's one of the reasons they really didn't like the Samaritans, because of the impure inheritances that they had. When the Assyrians captured the northern regions, they carted people, well, they didn't cart people off so much, they did cart some people off, but they actually flooded the land with their own people. And as they did that, and they started having this intermarrying, this intermixing, it kind of tainted the legacy and the inheritance. And so good Jews didn't trust the Samaritans with, either their inheritances or their religious philosophies because of those mixings. But if you go back to the Deuteronomy 24, it says at the very end, do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. It's interesting, it is the idea of the land really talking about the nation? Or is it talking about the inheritance? Something that we want to think through, and I don't know that we want to talk about it today, but when the people were not allowed to enter Israel, or enter Canaan, they wandered for 40 years. Why did they wander for 40 years? Because they didn't trust God. That is akin to us not being able to enter the kingdom. What kingdom? The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, because we don't trust him. So entering the land, entering the kingdom is of great import. And that's something God really cares about. So this is the verse that was under argument, and how they would have argued it, and how Jesus is saying, look, that's not even what that verse talks about. There is no command there for or against divorce. The command is centered on protections for the inheritance and lineage. It's not about whether or not divorce is appropriate. Now, he does get to that in chapter 19. I tell you, as we finished verse 8, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Your, meaning the people, humanity's hearts were hard. They, Genesis 3, went their own way, decided their own things, pursued their own pursuits. It was not this way from the beginning. Genesis 1, Genesis 2. It wasn't created that way. That's not the way that God designed it. So if you really want to argue the point, you're arguing something after God's design. You want to go all the way back to the reality, go to God's design. What was it designed to be? But I tell you here, verse 9, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. So it seems to be that Jesus is both constricting the allowances for divorce by saying divorce might occur, and it might occur in this situation, but he's also liberating. Because if adultery occurs, what was the law? Stoning, death. So Jesus is saying this is going to occur. Divorce occurs. Not designed that way, but divorce occurs. When it occurs, I lost my place. Except for when adultery occurs, we don't die. It doesn't call for death. Okay, this is a new way for them. It's a new thought for them. So it's kind of a two-part thing. Jesus is explaining the law, but also explaining some freedoms that they hadn't ever talked through before. So divorce shouldn't occur unless there's some sort of sexual... adultery. If you think about what adulterating something means. Adulterating is when you bring in something from the outside that causes the inside to be less valuable. Okay? You can adulterate pure gold by introducing some sort of impurity from the outside. You adulterate a marriage by bringing in an impurity, something that was not designed, from the outside. So, when adultery occurs, that is, we bring in something from the outside that was not originally intended or not originally designed, then we have adulterated the marriage. When that occurs, no stoning is to happen. That's a new command. It kind of removes this idea that was in the law. But at the same time, Jesus is saying that's the only reason divorce could occur. So it's kind of this little two-part thing. They thought any and every reason divorce could occur. They also thought adultery was a reason for death penalty. Jesus is kind of hitting the middle of that and saying, no more death penalty, but that's the only reason that divorce can occur. Okay? And the disciples are left scratching their heads. Wait a minute, they say. So if marriage is that constricting, it sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? If it's that hard to get out of, then it's better not to do it at all. Now remember, the teaching that they most likely grew up in was that teaching of Rabbi Hillel, where everybody should be married, but if your wife seasons your food wrong, then you could issue her a divorce and go find another wife. And so that's the experience the disciples may have had, and so they're listening to Jesus teaching, going, wait a minute, that's contrary to what I understood marriage to be and how things worked. And so they're saying, well, wait a minute. Verse 10. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry. And Jesus immediately says, no, that's not what I meant, right? No. Jesus takes it and says, well, let's start from that point. Let's start from the idea that you think it's better not to marry, if this is the case. Not everyone can accept this word, he says, verse 11. but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who have been born that way. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who chose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. What does that mean? Jesus is saying, I'm not saying you're wrong, disciples. You know, you're onto something when you say, you know, it's better not to be married. But let's talk about that. How many people can live like that? How many people can live righteously outside of the bonds of marriage? Remember today we said more and more people, or should I say less and less people, are getting married? Well, is that because they're devoutly single? Is that because they can withhold themselves? No. Because honestly, God designed us to be man and woman. Incidentally, we could use this argument for heterogeneous marriages. Don't want to teach that today, but we could use this argument for that. Okay? Anyway. People can't control themselves. We're human. We were built with sex in mind. And it was good. So, Jesus is saying, most people can't live like it. You're onto something, disciples. You're really onto something, but most people can't live like that. Let me give you 3 categories of people who can. Some people are born with anomalies. They just are born without either the sex drive or without the equipment. Okay? Another set of people are forced into that. And he describes what we would know of today as the eunuch who was in charge of harems or large rich people's bedchambers, okay, one might say. This was the person who, if you were financially able, you would hire someone to take care of your family. You would hire someone to care for maybe your wife, but you didn't want the risk that the Potiphar's wife thing might happen. And so you forced someone into a physical, biological position where they couldn't have sex with your wife, or they couldn't have sex with your concubines. We see this, someone that's described this way in Esther, when the manager of the harem, when Esther and a lot of other ladies were put forward to the king to see who would be his next wife. Well, they didn't want this manager of the harem to run through the harem before the king got to him. Okay? So that's the kind of person that would be forced on them by someone else. So you've got people who were born in a state of anomaly. You have people who were forced into a position where they couldn't have sex. And then you have this category of people who, by choice, for the glory of God, for the promotion of God, for the study of God, for the ability to shine the light of God, they refrain from marriage. They refrain from intimacy. But notice he says, not everyone can do this. And then he says in verse 11, only those to whom it has been given. I read that as, in order to live that kind of life, you have to have some spiritual oomph given to you by God. Okay? It's not just a choice you make. It's a gift that's given in order to live in it, because you weren't designed that way. God didn't design the human body to not want it. So you have to have a gift that drives you from that idea so that you can live this way, in this way that's described. But then he says, the one who can accept this should accept it. In other words, very few. Jesus says, not many can live that way. Yeah, disciples, you're on to something. Paul said the same thing later in 1 Corinthians 7, I believe it was. And I think he was already widowed, and I think he was talking to those who were widowed and widowers, and says, hey, if you can handle it, I think it's better that you live like I live. Continue your life without a spouse. However, it's better to be married than to burn with passion. And so he recognizes, hey, this isn't for everybody. Okay? So, disciples, you're onto something, but it's for the select few. Otherwise, get married. But hold yourself to the standard of marriage. Hold yourself to the way it was designed to be. That's the discussion that Jesus presents. And because he presented it that way, the Pharisees had no argument. He took the wind out of their sails. Does he discuss right and wrong for divorce? We could get into that. He does lay down reason for divorce. It's not a reason dictated by law. It's a reason that he stated as God, but is a reason that he stated. He does not discuss what adultery means. He uses a word that we could construe in lots of ways. In fact, it has been construed in lots of ways. I think the best way to construe it is sexual intimacy, if you have sexual intimacy outside of marriage. But we do know in Matthew, earlier in Matthew, he said, if you have roving eyes, then you have committed adultery in your heart. So, that kind of opens a discussion, doesn't it? What does this mean? To what extent does it have to do with it? We haven't talked about abuse. When we talk about adulterating the marriage, adulterating the intimate relationship, adulterating the family, that's bringing something outside in. Is it only sexual? Or is it the giving up of what the purpose is for another motivation? And abuse could be that. I haven't discussed that, and I don't think I want to at this stage. That is a long discussion, and we don't have, obviously we're already over time today, but we don't have time to really pursue that discussion in the course of this. It is definitely something that is on some people's hearts and can and probably should be discussed. It's not where Jesus is going, though. It's obvious that Jesus is promoting a very exclusive rationale for divorce, given the disciples' response. Whoa, Jesus, if that's true, it's better not to get married at all. Yep. But most people can't, he says. Okay, most people can't do that. Therefore, do it the way it was created. Do it the way God intended. Next week we'll start with little children. Little children, I don't know why either Matthew or later editors or Jesus said it this way. Why was this interruption here? Because in my head, verse 13 kind of links itself to verse 2. I could be wrong on that. But the activity that Jesus is engaged in ministering on this side of the river, it says he was over there and people were coming to him and he was healing most of them. I didn't say most of them. He was healing them. Verse 13 picks up, and people were bringing their kids to him. So in my head, I'm thinking, well, that could have been the same scenario, the same situation. We just kind of have this section that just kind of got plopped in here. And it may be that that happened at the same time, and it was all in the course of one day. Okay? Or it may not be, and for some reason, Matthew or an editor came in and put it there. But I do think Matthew 13 somehow links itself to Matthew 2. So we'll talk about children briefly, and then we will launch into the episode with what we often refer to as the rich young ruler. I think the rich young ruler story flows directly into the parable that we get in chapter 20. Unfortunately, we won't have time to cover all of that, so that'll get broken up. But that's where we're shooting for next week. The week after that will be Easter. I don't plan on doing anything special. I think we'll just continue with Matthew unless you have other thoughts and desires. We'll just keep pushing on. And it may work out perfectly that, we have an Easter lesson. We'll just have to see how that works. Because it does say right after, in chapter 20, right after the parable, Jesus predicts his death a third time. So if we happen to make it that far, and we get to that point, we'll have an Easter lesson anyway. Let's pray and we'll get dismissed. Lord, thank you so much for today. Thank you for the word that you've given to us and the men that handed down this word and the women who encouraged and strengthened and even taught, Father. Thank you, Father, for the opportunity we have, the freedom we have in this land to open your word, to think through it, to talk through it, to apply it to our lives. Father, in this case, as we look at marriage and we look at adulterating that marriage, help us to hold you and your Spirit in our hearts and in our relationships with each other. Help us to firmly grasp the bonds that you've given to us of man and woman. And help us to do what we can. We didn't have time to discuss today ways that we could strengthen marriage and keep items of adultery out of our marriage. But help us to each strengthen our marriage in ways that hold it true and to keep boundaries around it so that outside influences can stay away. Lord, thank you, Father, for Jesus. Thank you for forgiveness for the times we fail you. We all fail so often. And we're sorry for that. We ask that you give us strength to get back up and strength to focus on you, and that once again we can shine your light to those around us. Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity of salvation. We pray this through your Son, Jesus. Amen.